On a sweltering summer day in 1205, Lady Eleanor of Normandy only meant to arrive at St. Agnes Abbey to meet her betrothed. She hadn't smiled since receiving Lord Hastings' letter 3 days prior. But there she sat, a bride in waiting, left behind because her intended's family thought 38 was too old for marriage. She had travelled 400 leagues for love, only to find herself abandoned. Sometimes life's greatest blessings come disguised as heartbreak. As the abbey bells tolled noon, neither she nor the approaching night knew their lives were about to change forever. The sun beat mercilessly against the abbey's stone walls, turning the courtyard into a furnace of shimmering heat. Eleanor sat straight-backed on a wooden bench, her travelling cloak folded neatly beside her, despite the warmth. Her fingers traced the parchment in her lap, its cruel words memorized after countless readings. Circumstances changed. Family concerns. Regarding age. Journey regretted. Arrangement dissolved. The courtyard's brilliant light seemed to mock her dark thoughts. Sparrows darted between the cloister columns, their freedom a stark contrast to her own trapped circumstances. 4 days' journey from Normandy, with no immediate way to return with dignity intact. "My lady, perhaps some refreshment?" Abbot Thomas approached, his kind eyes unable to mask his pity. "The day grows warmer still." "Thank you, Father, but I require nothing." Her voice remained steady, a small victory. The language of her childhood returned easily after years of practice, her English barely touched by Norman accent. The abbot hesitated. "Lord Hastings' messenger left funds for your return journey. We can arrange. I shall need a day to consider my options." Eleanor cut him off gently. Ladies didn't interrupt, her mother would say, but she was already ruined in the eyes of 2 countries. What mattered one more breach of etiquette? Across the courtyard, the heavy wooden gates groaned open. A wagon rolled through, laden with sacks of grain and bundles of dried herbs. The knight who guided it was dust-covered from travel, his surcoat bearing the faded emblem of a local lord. Sir Rowland of Thornfield had not visited the abbey in nearly a year, not since burying his wife in its cemetery. The summer sun felt wrong on his skin, too bright for a world that had lost its light. He'd only come because the bailiff insisted they needed the abbey's blessing for the new grain stores. "Sir Rowland," the abbot greeted him warmly. "God smiles. Upon your timing, the brothers will welcome these provisions." Rowland nodded curtly, his eyes drawn to the woman sitting alone. Something in her stillness caught his attention. Not the defeated slump of surrender, but the rigid posture of someone holding grief at bay through sheer will. He recognized that posture. He'd lived it for 3 years. "The lady?" he asked quietly. "Eleanor of Normandy." The abbot's voice dropped. "Journeyed for a marriage that will not happen. Lord Hastings found her," he hesitated, "unsuitable." Rowland's eyes narrowed. The woman's finely woven travelling dress, her dignified bearing, everything about her spoke of nobility and grace. What fool would find such a lady unsuitable? Eleanor felt the knight's gaze and raised her eyes to meet his. No tears marred her face, only a composed dignity that struck Rowland to his core. In her steady gaze, he saw his own reflection. Someone who understood how the world could shatter in an instant, leaving only fragments of what might have been. The abbey library stood cool and quiet against the afternoon heat, a sanctuary of aged parchment and leather-bound wisdom. Eleanor had retreated here when the pitying glances of passing monks became too much to bear. Tall windows of coloured glass transformed the harsh sunlight into pools of ruby and sapphire across the reading tables. She traced her finger along the spine of a psalter, finding comfort in its familiar contours. "Lady Eleanor," the abbot's voice broke the silence. "Sir Rowland wishes to speak with you, if you are willing." She turned, surprised to see the dusty knight from the courtyard now standing beside Thomas. Rowland had removed his travel-stained surcoat, revealing a simple tunic that had seen better days. Yet he carried himself with the quiet dignity of one who had once known better fortune. "I would not intrude," Roland said, his voice low and roughened by disuse, "but I believe we might help one another." Eleanor nodded, curious despite herself. "Then speak plainly, Sir Knight. I have had my fill of courtly words that hide their true meaning." The abbot gestured to a nearby table. "I shall leave you to talk. Brother Matthew will remain for propriety." He nodded toward the elderly monk who sat in the corner, his quill scratching steadily across parchment, seemingly oblivious to their presence. When they were seated, Roland's weathered hands rested on the table between them, empty and open. "I hold Thornfield Manor half a day's ride east. It was once prosperous, but since my wife's passing 3 years ago, it has fallen into difficulty." "And this concerns me how?" Eleanor asked, though without rancor. "I need a lady to manage the household, to bring order where I have allowed chaos." His eyes met hers directly. "You need a place to go where you will be respected, not pitied." Eleanor stiffened. "If this is charity, it is necessity," Roland interrupted. "On both sides, I offer marriage, not out of pity, but because I recognize in you what I once saw in myself, someone who refuses to be broken by circumstance." The colored light shifted across the table as clouds passed outside. For a moment, Roland's face was illuminated in blue, then shadow, then gold, like a man transforming before her eyes. "You know nothing of me," Eleanor said softly. "I know you traveled far for a man who proved unworthy. I know you sit with dignity rather than tears. I know the look of someone who has built their life around purpose, not merely pleasure." "Brother." Matthew's quill paused, his aged ears apparently sharper than they appeared. "I was a teacher in Normandy," Eleanor said after a long silence. "I instructed the daughters of nobles in letters, numbers, music." Roland nodded. "My estate has children who run wild. The village has no school, and my accounts—" A flicker of shame crossed his face. "Catherine managed them. I am a soldier, not a steward." Eleanor studied him. Not young this night, perhaps 45, with silver threading his dark hair and lines carved by grief around his eyes. Not handsome in the way of courtly knights from romances, but solid, present, real in a way Lord Hastings' flowery letters never were. "You propose marriage to a stranger," she said. "Based on what? An impression formed in the space of an afternoon." "Based on necessity," Roland answered, then added more softly, "and perhaps a recognition that God sometimes places the right person in our path when we least expect it." The stained glass cast a pattern of light across Eleanor's hands, hands that had nowhere to go, nothing to build, no purpose to fulfill. "Unless—" "Tell me more about Thornfield," she said. Sunset transformed St. Agnes's humble chapel into a cathedral of light. Amber and rose streamed through the simple windows, painting the stone walls with heaven's palette. Eleanor stood before the altar in the same travelling dress she had worn for 4 days, now hastily brushed and adorned with sprigs of lavender from the abbey garden. No wedding finery, no family procession, only the quiet certainty that survival sometimes required courage over caution. "You need not do this," Abbot Thomas said softly as they waited for Roland. "The abbey can provide shelter until arrangements are made for your return to Normandy." Eleanor's fingers touched the small wooden cross at her throat, her only ornament. "And return as what, father? The twice-rejected spinster?" The burden passed between relatives. She shook her head. "Better to forge a new path than retreat down an old one." The chapel door opened, admitting Roland in his best tunic, still threadbare at the edges, but clean and pressed. He had trimmed his beard and combed his hair, small gestures that revealed his respect for the occasion, if not the conventional joy of a bridegroom. Behind him trailed a small procession of curious villagers, word having spread with the speed that only scandalous news could travel. "It seems we have witnesses," Roland said, his voice low as he took his place beside her. "Good. Let them see that I come to you by choice, not necessity." The words were for him alone. Her chin lifted in the same dignity he had first noticed. In the courtyard, the abbot cleared his throat. "Dearly beloved, we gather in God's sight to witness the joining of Sir Roland of Thornfield and Lady Eleanor of Normandy in holy matrimony." The words echoed in the small space, solemn and ancient. Through them, Eleanor felt the weight of generations who had stood where she now stood, promising forever to those they barely knew. Arranged marriages were common among nobility. Was this so different? At least she had chosen her arrangement, negotiated her own terms. "I, Roland, take thee, Eleanor, to be my wedded wife." His voice was steady, his weathered hand warm as it held hers. Not the soft hand of a courtier, but a warrior's hand, capable, present. When her turn came, Eleanor spoke clearly, her Norman accent more pronounced under emotion. "I, Eleanor, take thee, Roland, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold. From this day forward." A ring passed between them, a simple band that had belonged to Roland's mother, he explained in a whisper. It fit her finger as if meant for her, though its weight felt strange, foreign. As the final blessing was pronounced, the chapel door opened again. 3 village women entered, bearing small bundles. The oldest stepped forward as the ceremony concluded. "We heard Sir Roland was taking a bride," she said, offering her package wrapped in clean linen. "Dried herbs for your new home, my lady, for healing and for blessing." The second woman presented a length of new spun wool. "For warmth in your first winter together." The third, youngest of the 3, shyly extended a small wooden box. "Honey from my father's hives. That sweetness may find you both." Eleanor accepted each gift with genuine gratitude, these first tokens of welcome more precious than any dowry chest. As they turned to leave the chapel, now husband and wife before God and witnesses, the setting sun cast their shadows long across the stone floor, 2 separate silhouettes stretching forward, not yet merged into one, but moving in the same direction. In the doorway, Roland hesitated. "Ready?" he asked, the question encompassing far more than their immediate departure. Eleanor took a deep breath. "No," she answered honestly, "but waiting will not make me more so." The forest road to Thornfield wound like a green tunnel beneath ancient oaks, dappled sunlight playing across the wagon's weathered boards. Eleanor sat beside Roland, the small bundle of wedding gifts nestled in her lap. Their journey had been largely silent, each lost in private contemplation of the vows so hastily exchanged. What does one say to a stranger who is now a spouse? "My lord," a voice called from ahead. A lanky youth of perhaps 15 summers emerged from around the bend, his face lighting with relief. "I feared you'd been delayed another day." "Will," Roland acknowledged. "I bring news, and my lady wife." The boy's mouth fell open, his eyes darting from Roland to Eleanor and back again. "Wife?" he managed finally, executing an awkward bow. "My lady, Welcome?" Eleanor inclined her head graciously. "Thank you, Will. I understand you serve as Sir Roland's squire." "Yes, my lady, though I do most everything else besides." His candour brought a small smile to her lips, the first Roland had seen. The wagon lurched suddenly, tilting sharply to one side. Roland cursed under his breath as they jolted to a stop. "The wheel," Will confirmed after a quick inspection. "Split, clean through where it was mended last winter." Roland's face darkened. "Another expense we can ill afford." He helped Eleanor down, his touch impersonal but careful. "We'll need to unload the supplies before we can lift the axle." Eleanor surveyed the situation, then calmly began gathering her skirts. "The Abbey's gift should be removed first," she said. "The grain sacks can wait, but the herbs and medicines will spoil if crushed." Working together, they created a system. Roland lifting the heavier items, Will running them to the roadside, Eleanor directing which should go where. When the wagon was emptied, she surprised both men by kneeling to examine the broken wheel. Herself, "The wood's grain has weakened along this joint," she observed. "My father's steward taught me something of carpentry. If we bind it with the leather from your spare saddle strap, it may hold until we reach Thornfield." Roland's eyebrows rose, but he followed her suggestion. The repair took shape under their combined efforts, Eleanor's slender fingers surprisingly deft with the tough leather. "A lady who knows wagon repair," Will whispered to Roland as they reloaded the supplies. "Is she a witch or a saint?" "Neither," Roland replied. "Simply practical." The mended wheel creaked but held as they crested the final hill. Below them, Thornfield Manor spread across a small valley, far more modest than its grand name suggested. The central hall's thatched roof sagged in places, and the surrounding fields showed signs of neglect. Only the chapel stood strong, its small stone tower rising above the wooden buildings like a sentinel. Eleanor's face revealed nothing, but her hands tightened slightly on the bundle in her lap. "It was better once," Roland said quietly. "And could be again?" "It has good bones," she replied after careful consideration. "Like a body weakened by fever, not disease. Recovery is possible with proper care." The wheel gave an ominous crack as they began their descent. "That repair won't last much longer," Roland warned. Eleanor met his gaze directly. "Few things do," she said, "but that doesn't mean the effort was wasted." As they approached the manor gates, Eleanor straightened her spine, adjusting the simple wooden cross at her throat. Whatever waited beyond those gates, whatever challenges this new life held, she would face them with the same dignity that had caught Roland's attention in the Abbey courtyard. Not because she felt brave, but because there was simply no other choice. Thornfield's great hall stood dim and musty, dust motes dancing in the few sunbeams that penetrated its shuttered windows. Eleanor took inventory with a careful eye. Rushes that hadn't been changed in months, trestle tables stacked haphazardly against one wall, tapestries dulled by years of wood smoke. A hall that had once seen feasts and merriment now felt like an abandoned church, a place where memories were preserved but life no longer dwelled. "Agnes," Roland called, his voice echoing in the empty space. "We have returned." An elderly woman emerged from the shadows of the kitchen passageway, wiping gnarled hands on a stained apron. She froze at the sight of Eleanor, her rheumy eyes widening. "My lord, you've brought a lady," she said, attempting a curtsy that her aged bones protested. "My wife," Roland corrected. "Lady Eleanor of Normandy. We were married at St. Agnes Abbey yesterday." Agnes crossed herself, surprise giving way to something like hope. "God be praised," she whispered. "These walls have needed a lady's touch." Eleanor stepped forward, taking the old woman's hands in her own. "I am grateful for your service to Sir Roland. I hope we may work together to restore Thornfield to what it once was." Agnes's eyes filled with tears. "Catherine would have wanted that. She would have—" The words faltered. "Show Lady Eleanor to her chambers," Roland instructed, his voice suddenly tight. "The east solar, I think. It catches the morning light." As Agnes led her through the manor, Eleanor mentally catalogued each space they passed. The kitchen with its enormous hearth, now cold and ash-filled. The buttery where barrels lay empty, sleeping chambers for servants, now used to store broken furniture. And finally, the east solar, a chamber clearly unused for years, its bed frame draped with linen cloths to protect it from dust. "Was this—" Eleanor began carefully. "No, my lady," Agnes answered the unfinished question. "The Lady Catherine's chambers remain as they were. Sir Roland hasn't allowed anyone to disturb them." After helping Eleanor settle, Agnes shuffled away to prepare a simple meal. Left alone, Eleanor began a more thorough inspection of her new home. In the still, golden light of late afternoon, she opened cupboards, tested floorboards, gauged the integrity of ceiling beams. Thornfield wasn't just neglected. It was a home in mourning, frozen in time at the moment of its lady's death. She found Roland in a small chamber off the main hall. Unlike the rest of the manor, this room was meticulously maintained. Fresh rushes covered the floor, and beeswax candles burned in iron holders. At its centre stood a table bearing Catherine's possessions, a silver comb, an embroidery frame with half-finished work, a small, painted wooden box. Roland knelt before it, so lost, in thought he didn't hear Eleanor enter. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said softly. He stood quickly, like a boy caught in mischief. This was her work chamber. "I keep it as it was." Eleanor approached carefully, noting the fine stitches on the abandoned embroidery. She had skill with a needle. She had skill with everything, Roland said. "The accounts, the household, the tenants. I was often away fighting. She kept Thornfield prosperous without me." Eleanor recognized the shrine for what it was, not just to Catherine, but to Roland's own failure to maintain what his wife had built. "Agnes has prepared something to eat," she said, "and afterward perhaps you might show me the account ledgers." Her face clouded. "The accounts are in poor order. I've been meaning to—" "I have some skill with figures," Eleanor interrupted gently. "At the Abbey, you spoke of partnership. Let me help where I can." Later, by candlelight, the extent of Roland's financial troubles lay exposed in columns of faded ink. Debts to local merchants, unpaid taxes to his lord, dwindling stores with harvest still months away. Eleanor's heart sank, but her expression remained composed. "It is worse than you told me," she said simply. Roland's shoulders slumped. "Now you see the true burden you've married." Eleanor closed the ledger carefully. "Not a burden, Sir Roland, a challenge." She looked toward Catherine's shrine, visible through the open door. "And I believe she would not want her legacy to be your defeat." The first tentative breath of spring whispered across Thornfield's abandoned gardens. Winter's grip had loosened, just enough for Eleanor to discover what lay beneath the tangle of dead vines and frozen earth, the bones of what had once been a carefully tended herb garden. She knelt in the cold soil, her borrowed gloves already stained with dirt, as she gently uncovered the hardy rosemary that had somehow survived both winter and neglect. Lady Catherine started that garden the first year of their marriage, Agnes said, approaching with a basket of kitchen scraps for compost. 2 months at Thornfield had built a cautious friendship between the women. Had a way with growing things, she did. Eleanor sat back on her heels, surveying the plot she'd spent days clearing. "Then we shall honor her by bringing it back to life." From the pouch at her waist, she withdrew the packet of dried herbs given as a wedding gift at the Abbey. Carefully, she separated the seeds from the leaves, organizing them on a piece of linen. "What's that, milady?" A small voice piped up from beyond the low stone wall. Eleanor looked up to find 3 children watching her with undisguised curiosity, a girl of perhaps 7 and 2 younger boys, their clothes patched but clean. "These are seeds for healing," Eleanor explained, beckoning them closer. "This one grows into feverfew for headaches, and this becomes chamomile to help one sleep." The children drew closer, eyes wide with wonder as Eleanor explained each seed's purpose. Soon they were kneeling beside her, small fingers carefully making furrows in the prepared soil. "My mother says you're a Norman witch," the girl announced matter-of-factly, pressing a sage seed into the earth. "But you don't look like a witch to me." "Matilda," Agnes scolded, but Eleanor laughed. Her first genuine laugh since arriving at Thornfield. "I'm Norman, yes," she acknowledged, "but no more a witch than you are." "Can you teach us letters?" the oldest boy asked suddenly. "Father Simon says only boys born to lords learn letters, but I want to know them." Eleanor's hands stilled in the soil. "Would your parents allow it?" The children exchanged glances. "Some might," Matilda said doubtfully. Father needs help with figuring the seed count, and Mother says it's a sin that he can't write his name. On feast day records, from the shade of a nearby oak, Roland watched the scene unfold. He'd returned from inspecting the winter-damaged fences to find his once desolate garden transformed, not just by Eleanor's careful planting, but by the presence of village children who had previously avoided Thornfield like a plague house. She means to teach them, Agnes said, joining him, just as she's been teaching Will his numbers these past weeks. Roland frowned. The village folk may resist. They're suspicious of outsiders, especially Norman ones. Then perhaps 'tis time they remembered that suspicion alone doesn't fill empty bellies. Agnes nodded toward Eleanor. She's been setting your house in order, bit by bit. The accounts are clear for the first time in years. The stores are organized. Even the rushes smell sweet again. The afternoon sun caught Eleanor's profile as she demonstrated how to cover the seeds with just the right amount of soil. Her careful French enunciation mingled with the children's rough English, creating a strange harmony. Master Cooper won't allow it, came a harsh voice from the garden entrance. A broad-shouldered villager stood glowering, his daughter Matilda shrinking behind Eleanor. We don't need Norman ideas poisoning our children. Eleanor rose slowly, dignity intact, despite her soil-stained gown. Master Cooper, I presume. Your daughter has a quick mind. It would be a shame to leave it fallow, like this garden was. Manage our own, the man replied stiffly. As you should, Eleanor agreed, but knowledge, like seeds, grows best when shared. She held out a small packet. Comfrey, for your wife's cough that Matilda mentioned. The knowledge of how to use it comes with the seeds, if you'll accept both. The standoff stretched into uncomfortable silence. Roland moved to intervene, but Eleanor's slight headshake stopped him. This was her battle to fight. Cooper finally took the packet, though his scowl remained. Seeds are welcome, foreign teachings are not. As he led the reluctant children away, Roland approached Eleanor. That may not be the last resistance you face. No, she agreed, turning back to her planting, but few worthwhile things grow without meeting some resistance from the soil. The storm arrived with no gentle warning, only a sudden darkening of the mid-spring sky before the heavens unleashed their fury. Rain hammered against Thornfield's thatched roofs, finding every weakness, every patch Roland had meant to repair, but hadn't. Eleanor moved through the great hall, positioning buckets beneath the worst leaks, her skirts already damp from a dash to close the kitchen shutters. Will brings word from the north pasture, Agnes reported, her arthritis-twisted hands wringing. Anxiously, the stream's rising fast. The young lambs... A crash of thunder swallowed her words as the door burst open. Roland stood silhouetted against a sky of violent purple, rain streaming from his cloak. The lower meadows flooding, he announced grimly. We need to move the livestock to higher ground before the water rises further. Eleanor abandoned her bucket placement. What can I do? Roland hesitated only briefly. 3 months of marriage had taught him that her capable hands rarely faltered, regardless of the task. The lambing pen needs to be evacuated first. They'll need dry shelter in the old barn. Outside, the world had transformed to chaos. The gentle stream that bordered Thornfield's grazing lands had become a roaring monster, brown water churning with debris. Eleanor could see Will and 2 field workers struggling to herd panicked sheep away from the rapidly disappearing banks. "My lady, you shouldn't," one of the men began as Eleanor approached, her hood whipping in the wind. "Save your breath for the work," she interrupted, already moving toward the lambing pen where frightened ewes huddled with their newborns. The pen's gate had warped in the downpour, resisting Roland's efforts to open it. Without hesitation, Eleanor joined him, her smaller hands finding purchase where his could not, working the latch free. "Like the wagon wheel," Roland shouted over the storm's roar, a memory of their journey to Thornfield surfacing unexpectedly. Same principle. Eleanor agreed, her smile brief but genuine, as the gate finally swung open. They worked as a unit, Roland creating a path through the rising water, Eleanor following with lambs tucked against her chest, their soft bodies trembling. Back and forth they went, evacuating the youngest animals first, then helping Will guide the adult sheep toward higher ground. A sudden crack split the air, louder than thunder, more terrible in its implications. The old oak that had stood sentinel over the stream for generations was giving way, its roots undermined by the churning waters. "Will!" Roland bellowed, spotting his squire directly in the tree's path. Eleanor was closer. Without thought for her own safety, she dropped the empty grain sack she'd been using as protection and lunged toward the boy, shoving him roughly aside just as the massive trunk slammed into the flooded ground. Water exploded around them like a fountain. "Eleanor!" Roland's voice carried raw fear as he fought his way toward them. He found them in the shallows. Will dazed but unharmed, Eleanor on her knees, her gown plastered to her body, laughing with the wild relief of those who have glimpsed death and escaped its grasp. "You're unharmed?" Roland helped her to her feet, his hands lingering on her arms longer than necessary, his inspection more thorough than propriety might allow. "Merely baptized," she assured him, pushing sodden hair from her face. "Though I doubt I'll ever be truly dry again." The rain continued its assault, but the animals were secure, the worst danger averted through their combined efforts. Roland looked at his wife, really looked at her perhaps for the first time. Her fine-boned Norman features were flushed with exertion, her educated hands as mud-streaked as any peasant's. Yet there was nothing diminished in her bearing, nothing to suggest she felt such work beneath her. "We make a good team, Lady Eleanor," he said finally, the words simple but weighted with new significance. Eleanor's eyes met his, recognition flowing between them like the current that still tugged at their ankles. "Yes," she agreed quietly, "I believe we do." In that moment, with the storm still raging around them, something shifted, a foundation settling into place, where before there had been only uncertain ground. Summer sun warmed Eleanor's back as she knelt in her thriving herb garden, the scent of lavender and thyme rising around her like incense. The seeds planted in hope during those first tentative days of spring had flourished under her care. Each morning she found herself here, tending the growing plants with the same quiet determination she brought to all aspects of Thornfield's revival. "The chamomile has prospered," Roland observed, his shadow falling across her work. "In the months since the flood, something had softened between them, not yet the intimacy of lovers, but a companionship built on mutual respect and shared purpose." "It likes poor soil," Eleanor replied, glancing up at him. "Sometimes the things that grow in the most challenging conditions prove the strongest." Roland's response was interrupted by Will's approach, accompanied by a rider in fine livery, the embroidered falcon of Lord Hastings clearly visible on his surcoat. "A messenger, sir," Will announced unnecessarily, his young face troubled. Eleanor rose slowly, brushing soil from her hands, a strange stillness coming over her features. "My lady," the messenger bowed low, "Lord Hastings sends his greetings and his deepest regrets for the unfortunate misunderstanding that occurred this past winter." "Misunderstanding?" Roland's voice had a dangerous edge. The messenger continued smoothly, "His lordship has dismissed his mother's objections and wishes to honor the original arrangement. He requests Lady Eleanor's return to fulfill their betrothal contract." The garden seemed to hold its breath. The chamomile and sage that had sprung from wedding gifts now witnessed this test of those same vows. "Lady Eleanor is my wife," Roland said flatly, "recognized by church and law. A hasty arrangement that could be set aside with proper compensation." The messenger extended a sealed parchment. Lord Hastings offers a generous settlement to relinquish all claims. Eleanor took the parchment without opening it, her face unreadable. Thank your lord for his consideration. I shall respond when I have reviewed his offer. The messenger was shown to guest quarters while Eleanor retreated to the great hall, the unopened message clutched in her hand. Roland followed, uncertain of his place in this moment. Was he an obstacle to her rightful happiness? Lord Hastings could offer wealth and position far beyond Thornfield's humble means. What will you do? He asked finally. Eleanor looked up, her expression thoughtful rather than troubled. What would you have me do? I would have you choose freely, Roland answered carefully. I took you from the abbey because you had nowhere else to go. Now you have another path. Is that what you believe? That our marriage was merely convenient shelter for a stranded traveller? Without waiting for his response, Eleanor rose and walked, purposefully toward the one door in Thornfield that remained perpetually closed, Catherine's chambers. Her hand hesitated only briefly on the latch before she pushed it open. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light that penetrated the long, shuttered room. Catherine's possessions lay exactly as she had left them. Combs on the dressing table, gowns in the open chest, embroidery abandoned mid-stitch. This is where you truly live, Eleanor said softly, in a room with a ghost. Roland remained in the doorway, tension visible in every line of his body. I couldn't bear to disturb her things. And yet you disturbed her garden to make space for mine. Eleanor picked up a silver comb, studying its tarnished surface. Perhaps it's time to do the same here. She moved to the shutters, opening them to let fresh air circulate for the first time in years. I need your help, Roland. Not to pack my belongings for Lord Hastings, but to honor Catherine properly. Not by preserving her in endless stillness, but by allowing life to continue. Together they began the gentle work of sorting, what to keep as treasured mementos, what to pass to those who could use them, what to put properly away. As the afternoon light faded, Eleanor finally broke the seal on Lord Hastings' offer, reading it carefully before placing it in the fire. You won't return to him? Roland asked, watching the parchment curl and blacken. I made vows at St. Agnes, Eleanor replied simply, and unlike Lord Hastings, I understand their worth. She placed Catherine's comb in a small cedar box alongside, a lock of hair and a wedding ring. We all carry our ghosts, Roland. The question is whether we let them haunt us or guide us. In the doorway, they paused, looking back at a room transformed. No longer a shrine, not yet truly Eleanor's, but a space where past and present had finally been allowed to meet. Thornfield's great hall blazed with torchlight for the first time in 4 years. Trestle tables stretched the length of the room, laden with the bounty of autumn, roasted meats, bread still warm from the ovens, and vegetables from Eleanor's garden, transformed by Agnes's skilled hands. The hall's ancient beams, scrubbed and polished, reflected the dancing flames of 100 candles, their light caught in the freshly cleaned tapestries that once again adorned the walls. Eleanor moved among the guests with practiced grace, her finest gown, a deep blue remade from one of Catherine's, marking her as the lady of the manor without ostentation. In the 7 months since her arrival, she had transformed more than Thornfield's physical spaces. The very atmosphere had shifted from mourning to cautious renewal. Your lady has worked wonders, Sir Geoffrey, a neighbouring knight, commented to Roland. Few would have believed Thornfield could rise again after Catherine's passing. Roland watched Eleanor guide Master Cooper's wife to a seat of honour near the fire, the same woman who had once forbidden her children to accept Eleanor's teachings. Now, those same children proudly displayed their newly acquired letters, chalking them on slate boards for amazed parents. She sees possibility where others see only ruin, Roland replied, surprising himself with the warmth in his voice. Near the hall's entrance, new arrivals caused a stir. Lord Edmund and his wife, the highest ranking, nobles in the region. Their presence at Thornfield's humble feast was unexpected, their assessment critical as they surveyed the gathered company. Sir Roland, Lady Margaret's voice carried a brittle edge. How rustic to include the peasantry at your table. Eleanor appeared at Roland's side, her smile serene. Our people shared the labor of bringing in the harvest, my lady. It seems only fitting they share in its celebration. Our people? Lady Margaret's eyebrow arched. You've embraced your role quickly for a Norman bride acquired under such unusual circumstances. The barb struck its target. Eleanor's cheeks coloured slightly, but her composure remained intact. Unusual circumstances often yield unexpected blessings, my lady. As the feast progressed, whispered judgment circulated among the noble guests. Eleanor's hasty marriage, her rejected betrothal to Lord Hastings, the impropriety of her teaching, village children, all provided fodder for speculation. Yet for each critical glance, there came a counterbalance. A farmer offering his best mead in gratitude for Eleanor's healing herbs that had saved his ailing wife, or Will proudly demonstrating his newly acquired ability to read from the Psalter. They say she was too old for Lord Hastings, Lady Margaret's voice carried deliberately to Eleanor as she passed, though apparently not too old to secure a lesser knight's failing estate. The hall quieted, conversations faltering as all eyes turned to Eleanor, standing straight-backed beside the table where she had just placed a platter of apples from Thornfield's long-neglected orchard. She looked to Roland, uncertainty flickering briefly across her face. Roland rose, his goblet raised high. "To the Lady of Thornfield," he proclaimed, his voice filling the sudden silence, "who took an estate in decline and a man in despair and found value in both." He turned to face Eleanor directly. "You chose to stay when offered a greater station. You built when others would have abandoned. You taught when others mocked learning, and you honored the past without being imprisoned by it." He stepped forward, taking her hand before the assembled company. "I took you as my wife for practical reasons, Eleanor of Thornfield. But I stand before our people tonight, humbled by the blessing that practicality has become." Eleanor's fingers tightened around his, a silent acknowledgement of how far they had travelled since that first meeting in the Abbey courtyard. The feast resumed with renewed vigour, Lady Margaret's criticisms fading beneath the genuine warmth that filled the hall. Later, as musicians played and children darted between the tables, Roland found Eleanor standing beside Catherine's empty chair at the high table, her fingers lightly touching its carved back. "She would approve," Roland said quietly. "Of all you've done here." Eleanor smiled, the torchlight catching the silver threads in her dark hair, threads she no longer tried to conceal. "Then let her chair remain empty no longer," she said, gently moving it aside and taking her rightful place beside her husband. Winter descended upon Thornfield with a silent ferocity, blanketing the world in pristine white. Eleanor stood at the bar window of their private chambers, watching snowflakes dance in the torchlight beyond the glass. Behind her, the fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth a shield against the bitter cold that had settled over the estate. In the 9 months since their hasty marriage, this room had transformed from Roland's solitary refuge to a shared sanctuary, where, slowly, they had begun to bridge the careful distance between them. The messenger finally made it through from the coast, Roland said, entering with a letter bearing a Norman seal. "From your family, I believe." Eleanor accepted the parchment with trembling fingers. "My sister Marie. I wrote to her after the harvest feast." She broke the seal, eyes moving swiftly over the elegant script. "She wishes to visit in spring, if the roads permit. She says—" Eleanor's voice caught. "She says our father was greatly distressed by the news of Lord Hastings's rejection and my subsequent marriage." Roland added another log to the fire, giving her privacy to compose herself. "Will you be pleased to see her?" "Very much." Eleanor carefully folded the letter. Marie was always my champion, even when others in our family found me difficult. Difficult, Roland smiled faintly. The woman who single-handedly reorganized Thornfield's accounts, established a village school, and revived a dying estate. I cannot imagine why. Eleanor laughed softly, but the sound held a melancholy edge. She moved to the fire, her fingers still clutching her sister's letter. Roland, there is something about Lord Hastings' rejection that I never told you. He sat opposite her, the firelight casting deep shadows across his face. You need not explain, but I wish to. Eleanor met his gaze directly. My age was merely the excuse he gave. The truth was far more practical. She took a steadying breath. I cannot bear children. An illness in my 20th year left me barren. Lord Hastings' mother discovered this from inquiries in Normandy and forbade the match. Understanding dawned in Roland's eyes, and you thought I might reject you as well, had I known. A knight needs heirs, Eleanor said simply. It's why I never. She gestured vaguely toward the bed they had shared in the most literal sense only, sleeping side by side, but maintaining a careful distance. Roland was silent for a long moment, watching the flames dance. I told you Catherine died of a fever, he said finally. That was true, but incomplete. He reached for the small wooden cup on the mantel, a memento from his shrine to Catherine that now held a place of honor in their shared chambers. She died in childbed, he continued, his voice rough. Our third child. The first two never drew breath. The midwife said her body was not made for bearing children, but Catherine insisted on trying again. His fingers tightened around the cup. I could have stopped her. Should have valued her life above a potential heir. Instead, I lost both. Eleanor moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. You cannot know that your intervention would have changed the outcome. Nor can I escape the guilt of wondering. He set the cup aside, to clasp her fingers more firmly. When Lord Hastings' messenger came offering to reclaim you, I feared you would go. Not because our marriage was one of convenience, but because I had failed to show you that your worth to me has nothing to do with the children you might bear. The fire hissed and popped as a snowflake found its way down the chimney, its brief life ending in a wisp of steam. Outside, the winter wind moaned around the corners of Thornfield like a restless spirit finally finding peace. I stayed, Eleanor whispered, because in the Abbey's darkness, you saw me when I was invisible to everyone else, not as a vessel for continuation, but as a woman with value of her own. Roland lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to each palm. The scholarly hands that had recorded accounts, planted gardens, and guided children's letters, all while carefully rebuilding what grief had broken. Eleanor of Thornfield, he said her name like a vow renewed, will you truly be my wife now? Not out of necessity or practicality, but because two broken paths have somehow formed a whole? She rose, drawing him up with her, the letter from Normandy falling forgotten to the rushes. I will, she answered, her voice steady as it had been at St. Agnes, but this time when they sealed their promise with a kiss, it held not the hesitant courtesy of strangers, but the tender certainty of those who had chosen each other, not, once in haste, but 1,000 times in the quiet moments of building a life together. Outside, snow continued to fall, each flake unique and perfect in its brief journey, before joining the blanket that covered Thornfield's scars and possibilities. Alike, the first hesitant breaths of spring whispered through Thornfield as February yielded to March. Ice retreated from the stream banks where Roland and Eleanor had once battled floodwaters, revealing tender green shoots pushing through the mud. In the orchard, buds swelled on branches that Eleanor had carefully pruned during winter's dormancy. Thornfield was awakening, stretching toward renewal after its long slumber. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the small chamber she had transformed into her school, watching Will instruct the younger children in their letters. Her chest swelled with quiet pride at the young squire's confidence, so different from the awkward boy who had greeted her nearly a year ago. The slate board she had installed on the wall bore neat rows of figures, accounts of the winter stores, remaining calculations of seed needed for spring planting. Lady Eleanor. Agnes appeared at her elbow, her rheumy eyes troubled. A royal messenger in the courtyard. Sir Roland is with him now. A chill that had nothing to do with the lingering winter air settled in Eleanor's stomach. Royal messengers rarely brought welcome news to knights of Roland's station. She found them in the great hall, Roland's face grave as he read a parchment bearing the king's seal. The messenger, a sharp-featured man with the hardened physique of a career soldier, stood rigidly at attention. "My lady," Roland looked up, his expression confirming her fears. "King John summons knights to service. There is trouble brewing with the French in Normandy." Normandy? Eleanor's hand went instinctively to her throat, where the simple wooden cross still hung. "When must you leave?" "A fortnight's time. The muster is at Dover." The messenger shifted, his weight, eyes assessing Eleanor with the calculating gaze of one who sized up potential weaknesses. "The campaign may last through summer, perhaps longer. His Majesty expects full commitment from his vassals." "And he shall have it," Eleanor said firmly, moving to stand beside Roland. "Thornfield has always fulfilled its obligations to the crown. If—" The messenger was surprised by her decisive tone. He masked it well. "The taxation requirements are detailed there?" He nodded toward the parchment. "Given the condition of this estate, provisions have been made for delayed payment." A flash of something, shame perhaps, or anger, crossed Roland's face. Eleanor recognized it immediately, the same expression he had worn when first showing her Thornfield's neglected accounts. "No delay will be necessary," she stated, reaching for the parchment. Roland surrendered it, watching as she scanned the figures with the practiced eye that had restored Thornfield's finances. "The taxation can be met in full before Sir Roland's departure." The messenger's skepticism was poorly concealed. "You seem unusually confident, my lady, for a woman facing the management of an estate alone." "Not unusual at all," Roland interjected, his voice carrying a new pride. "Lady Eleanor has been Thornfield's true steward since her arrival. The estate's recovery is largely her achievement." Will appeared in the doorway, summoned by Agnes. "You called for me, my lady?" "Yes." Eleanor nodded, her mind already calculating. "Logistics. Please bring the estate ledgers and the inventory from the north storerooms." While they waited, Eleanor maintained a steady stream of questions for the messenger: troop movements, expected duration, supply chains. Her knowledge of Normandy's geography impressed even the hardened soldier, whose responses grew increasingly respectful. When Will returned with the requested items, Eleanor demonstrated to the messenger's evident surprise that Thornfield could indeed meet its obligations. Her finger traced neat columns of figures that showed careful management and strategic planning. "You see," Roland said quietly, "Thornfield is in the most capable hands." Later, after the messenger had departed, Eleanor and Roland walked the boundaries of their estate. The winter bare trees would be leafing out by the time he returned, if he returned. Neither spoke the fear aloud, but it hung between them like morning mist. "I thought leaving Thornfield would be easier now," Roland finally said, pausing where the property stone marked the edge of their land. "Now that it's thriving again, but somehow it's harder, knowing what I stand to lose." Eleanor's hand found his, their fingers intertwining as naturally as the roots of the ancient oak that had nearly claimed her life during the flood. "Thornfield will be waiting," she promised. "As will I." In the fading afternoon light they surveyed what they had built together, not just the physical estate with its recovering fields and mended buildings, but the invisible bonds that connected them to each other and to this land. What had begun as a marriage of convenience, a shelter against abandonment and loneliness, had grown into something neither had dared hope for, a true partnership, rooted in respect and flowering against all odds into love. 1 year, Eleanor mused. Who would have thought a single year could change so much? Roland lifted their joined hands to his lips. Or that being rejected by Lord Hastings would prove the greatest fortune of your life. Her laughter, warm and genuine, drifted across the awakening fields. Or that a knight who once knelt before a shrine would learn to live again. They turned back toward Thornfield as twilight settled over the land, facing together whatever uncertainties the coming separation might bring. On a sweltering summer day in 1206, Eleanor of Thornfield only meant to honor a promise. She hadn't expected Roland's safe return so quickly, but there he stood, whole and unbowed, waiting at St. Agnes Abbey, where they had first met exactly 1 year before. She had travelled with hope in her heart, only to find her deepest prayers answered. Sometimes life's greatest blessings come disguised as ordinary moments. As the abbey bells tolled noon, Eleanor knew their story was not ending, but beginning anew. The courtyard blazed with the same merciless sun that had witnessed their first meeting, yet everything else had changed. Where once Eleanor had sat alone, abandoned and uncertain, now she was surrounded by familiar faces. Agnes dabbing tears with her apron, Will standing tall in new clothes befitting his growing responsibility, Master Cooper's children clutching small bouquets of meadow flowers. "You came." Roland's voice cut through the bustle, his eyes finding hers across the courtyard. 3 months of separation melted away in that single glance. "I promised I would," Eleanor replied, moving toward him through the gathered crowd, "though I did not expect you to return from campaign so soon. The king granted me special leave. When he heard my purpose," Roland's gaze dropped to the gentle swell of her abdomen, visible beneath her finest gown, "and when certain news reached court." Eleanor's hand moved protectively to her belly. "News travels faster than I expected, especially when carried by a Norman lady determined to reach her sister." Roland gestured toward where Marie stood, elegant and composed despite her journey from Normandy. "She arrived at court the day before my company returned from France." Abbot Thomas approached, his kind face weathered by another year, yet brightened by genuine pleasure. "The chapel awaits, whenever you are ready." He glanced between them, adding softly, "Though I must say, this ceremony feels rather different from your last." Indeed, where their first marriage had been hasty and pragmatic, witnessed by curious strangers, today's renewal of vows would be a true celebration. The wagon that had once carried Eleanor away as a near stranger now overflowed with gifts from Thornfield's villagers, woven blankets, carved toys for the child to come, jars of honey and preserved fruits. Inside the chapel, summer light filtered through the same windows that had witnessed their first uncertain promises. But now, each colored pane seemed to glow more brilliantly, reflecting the transformed reality of their union. "Dearly beloved," Abbot Thomas began, his voice carrying to the rafters, 1 year ago today, these two souls joined in matrimony within these very walls. They came as strangers brought together by circumstance. They return now as true partners, bound by choice and cherished by their community. Eleanor felt Roland's hand tighten around hers. How different his touch felt now, familiar, certain, beloved. "When I took your hand that day," Roland said, when it came time for him to speak, "I offered shelter to a woman left adrift. I thought I was extending mercy." His voice caught. "I did not know it was I who needed saving." "And I," Eleanor replied, Her clear voice, carrying the same dignity that had first caught his attention, thought I was accepting the least painful of limited choices. I could not see that I was being offered the rarest gift of all, the chance to build something lasting from broken pieces. The simple wooden cross that had been her only ornament on their wedding day still hung at her throat. But now it was accompanied by Catherine's locket, its silver polished to a soft shine. No longer a shrine to grief, but a testament to how the past could be honored while embracing the future. As they emerged from the chapel, hand in hand, Eleanor gasped softly. Along the abbey's sun-baked walls, where only bare stone had greeted her arrival a year ago, morning primroses now bloomed. In profusion, their delicate yellow flowers reaching toward the light. "They weren't here before," she whispered. "Brother Matthew planted them," Abbot Thomas explained, "said every new beginning deserves flowers to mark its place." Roland's hand moved to rest gently against the swell of new life beneath Eleanor's heart. A miracle neither had dared hope for, yet somehow granted, despite what both had believed impossible. "It seems," he said softly, "that life delights in proving our certainties wrong." The gathered community moved toward the abbey's refectory, where a feast awaited, leaving Roland and Eleanor briefly alone in the courtyard, where their unlikely story had begun. Eleanor's sister watched from a distance, her expression a mixture of wonder and approval. "She asked me," Eleanor said, "if I regretted being rejected by Lord Hastings." A smile touched her lips. "I told her that sometimes the greatest blessings arrive disguised as heartbreak." Roland drew her close, mindful of her changing form. "And sometimes," he added, "the most valuable treasures are those others deem too old, too broken, or too flawed to cherish." The primroses nodded in a gentle breeze. Their faces turned toward the sun, just as Eleanor and Roland turned toward their future, a future neither could have imagined when they first met on this very ground, both wounded, both adrift, both believing. Their best days were behind them. "Ready?" Roland asked, echoing the question he had posed after their hasty first ceremony. Eleanor's answer came without hesitation, her voice steady with the certainty of one who had found her true home. "Yes," she said simply, "for whatever comes next."